For starters, could you say and spell your name and tell me your official position?
Sure. It's Jeff, Jeff Lyons, Lyons, and I am the Chief Meteorologist at 14 News.
Can you talk to me a little bit about, I guess, just the tri-state and sort of the climate here in general? You know, it seems like recently we've seen a lot of fairly large storms. Is this an area that's known for that? Is it?
Yeah, wild weather really isn't anything new in the tri-state because we're close to the Gulf of Mexico, we're close to Canada and the plains. We get changes, very rapid changes in the weather here, and that's always been the case. In the last several years, we've seen more, variable or what some call extreme weather here. But the truth is, we've always had extreme weather in this part of the country, and it goes back through recorded history. I mean, we've had big tornadoes and big snowstorms, ice storms. So that's just part of living here.
How would you describe the climate in this area?
Well, the climate in Indiana and Kentucky and Illinois is temperate. So that means we have 4 seasons, and so we get some variability. We get very cold winters, hot summers, and everything in between, literally. And it is our climate really is marked, I think, by the tropical air that comes up from the south. Typically, we get about 42 to 44 inches of rain a year, which is a lot. And obviously, that's why we farm a lot in this area. And we're prone to some snow. The average snowfall in our part of the country is about 13 to 14 inches in a season. Tornado-wise, typically we'll see 2 to 3 in a year over our entire, tri-state area. So, like I said, we run the gamut. We can get everything here.
So when you sat down to think about what the 9 worst weather disasters were, I mean, how do you measure that? How do you kind of gauge that criteria, or at least how did you?
Yeah. When I look at the 9, biggest weather events here in the tri-state, what I looked at was which ones had the most impact on the most people, and then kind of an offshoot of that was which ones were spectacular in some way. The thing that leapt out the most, as far as affecting the most people, would have to be the 1937 flood. I mean, it was the benchmark, really, for all floods in this area. I think it was called a 500-year flood when it happened, meaning that, it's a very, very rare event. And there is hardly anyone of a certain age in this area that wasn't touched by the flood or knew somebody who was. The thing about the 1937 flood, I think, that was exceptional was, it happened in the 1930s, which was a decade that had some really extreme weather. 1936 was the heat wave. A lot of people associate that with the Dust Bowl years, the famous pictures and, Grapes of Wrath, all that were in the 1930s. And then in 37, you had this, catastrophic flood that not only impacted us, but basically every city along the Ohio River watershed.
Can you talk a little bit about the water levels, how it affects the city when you have something that catastrophic?
Sure. Well, Evansville, as many river cities, the river's kind of the lifeblood, and certainly in that time period it was for commerce and things like that, water for the crops. But again, it's kind of a sleeping giant, and you never know when that thing's going to wake up and come over the banks. And, the Ohio River had flooded several other times prior to that, certainly. There are documented floods from the 1920s. In fact, that's why the dams were built, to try to, increase navigation, keep the water levels more current or more stable. But in 1937, here comes the river, and it keeps coming up, and then up some more. And I think, every time they got a forecast, and bear in mind they didn't have the, sophisticated modeling that we have now. I'm sure it was much more unexpected, the result of the flood, how high it came. And, when the river tops out at 54 feet and you've got much of downtown under, chin deep water, that's going to impact a lot of people for a long period of time. All the pictures you see, are just almost unbelievable, because you look at a building that's there now, like say the McCurdy Hotel or some of the other ones downtown, and look at where the water was on them. And then you go down there today and you think, my gosh, the normal river stage is like 15 feet, 15 to 18 or so. Even when it gets up to 42 feet, which is flood stage in Evansville, it doesn't come over anything because we got a levee there now. Of course, back in the day, it would have gotten into many of the low areas of Evansville. So you see that impact in the pictures, and then you go look at it today, and it really, you understand why it was a 500-year flood.
Can you talk about that event on a national scale too? So the 37 flood didn't just affect Evansville.
Sure. There were cities up and down the Ohio River that were impacted by it. Cincinnati, Louisville, Evansville, even up, as far up to the mouth of the Ohio River into Pittsburgh, and then downriver once it meets the Mississippi there at Cairo and on down. There was flooding, over basically a third of the country in 1937. And you had a lot of impact from it that we probably wouldn't see today. Cholera, because the dirty water got into drinking water, typhoid, all kinds of problems. Not to mention the sheer number of people who were displaced, that lost their homes and lost everything. And that was back in the days before FEMA and, a more coordinated disaster response compared with what we have today.
Can you talk a little bit about, and it's going to sound like an obvious question.
Oh,
forgive me for that.
That's all right.
Can you talk about some of the conditions that led to that flood? Obviously, a lot of precipitation.
Yeah.
But can you just talk about the numbers there?
Well, and off the top of my head, I had talked to John Payne about this. He's a local climate guy for many years, weather observer, lived through the 1937 flood. The thing that comes out with the 1937 flood that made it exceptional was we had just rain after rain after rain up and down the Ohio River Valley, not just here in Evansville, not just in Louisville, but all up and down this valley. And we're talking several inches of rain. I can't remember exactly, but it seems like it was in the neighborhood of like 7 to 8 inches of rain spread over a short period of time, perhaps a week or two. And all that water had to go somewhere. All the tributaries were already flooded, so the river just continued to rise. And there was really no place for the water to go because the Mississippi River was elevated as well, so it just all kind of backed up. And that's why you saw this kind of flood across the entire area.
Before we jump into talking about some of the other weather events that happened that are part of this series, can you talk a little bit about sort of the committee process and how it was that we chose this, and just kind of the subjectivity of determining a list like this?
Well, when we looked at all the possible weather events, we each of us kind of chose the ones that we thought were the most impactful, the most spectacular, in terms of just almost unprecedented, or something that was truly of historic proportions. And between all of us, we came up with a short list, maybe of 10, 12, 13 events. And it was interesting that we all pretty much honed in on the big ones, the 37 flood, the 1925 tornado, and so on. But then trying to rank them was very difficult, because do you go by how many people were affected? Do you go by the sheer extreme nature of it, the size of a certain event? And that's where it got very interesting to try to figure that out.
Okay. Do you feel like there's anything that didn't make the list? Were there snubs, as it were? No,
I think our list was pretty thorough. For someone who's lived in the Tri-State for a number of years, and I use myself as the benchmark. I'm 50. I've spent, a half century here. There are certain events that you've either heard about growing up or you've experienced growing up, and those are the ones that stick in your mind. So you can rattle off, the June 8th storm, for example, or the November 6th tornado. Those are ones that, for people who have lived here a long time, will come right to mind, in addition to the 37 flood and the 1925 tornado and many others.
1925, the tornado in 25, not as big a direct effect on Evansville, but obviously a big effect in the Tri-State. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, the Tri-State tornado in 1925 just grazed the northern part of the Evansville area. It came into Posey County there at Griffin. When it crossed the river, it had come through southern Illinois, and then it ended or fizzled just south of Princeton. So it did, narrowly miss Evansville and Mount Vernon, by literally 20 to 30 miles. The thing about that storm, which is unprecedented, at least so far as we can tell, is that it appears it was a single tornado that made that 217-mile trip, from near Elliston, Missouri, all the way into almost Pike County, near Petersburg. And scientists from the Storm Prediction Center came out and did forensic meteorology. They went back, they interviewed landowners, they looked at satellite data, and there are scars from that storm. Trees that were split, we still have the scars in them, even though it was 1925. And they were able to determine that storm was more than likely on the ground for the entire length of its path, over 3 hours, and nearly 700 people killed. Not quite, but so something like that, which is the most deadly and is the deadliest tornado and the longest track tornado in U.S. history, and it happened right here. So I think that one, certainly was one that had to be included in this list.
There was some discussion about was it really in the range and that sort of thing. I hate to get into kind of what ifs, but how much worse could that have been had it been 20 or 30 miles south?
Oh, if that tornado had come through, Paducah and Mount Vernon, Evansville, and gone up the river at Jasper, perhaps. I mean, it could have been even more devastating than it already was, which was at that time unprecedented. I mean, you'd have to look at like a volcano or an earthquake to come up with a death toll and a scale of damage like that tornado brought. So yeah, the path of it, of course, for people in Illinois was unfortunate. There were many towns like Murfreesboro and several others that were just wiped off the map. So yeah, you never, that always stays in your mind, what if it had been a little farther south?
1978, the blizzard.
Mm-hmm.
I guess first of all, can you just kind of talk about it in general, and then we'll zero in?
Yeah, the blizzard of '78. Of course, I was alive for that one, so I have a little more skin in the game, so to speak. The thing about that was blizzard is kind of an unknown term in the tri-state. I mean, a true blizzard, a lot of people think it's a ton of snow and, it's like in the movies. But really, to have a blizzard, you have to have strong winds, sustained over 3 hours, and you have to have low visibility. There really is no other criterion for it. There's no snow accumulation, temperature, anything else. It's the wind and the visibility. And of course, you have to have some snow to cause that problem. So when the Weather Service came out with a blizzard warning for the Evansville area, a lot of people were like, what's that? I remember thinking, a blizzard? That, what? And but it lived up to its billing. It came in, the snow started coming, and we did get a fair amount of snow. I think we had 8 or 9 inches of snow where I lived on the west side of Evansville. And it blew, and there was no visibility, and, it shut the city down. I mean, literally shut the city down. There was not a thing moving. I think the newspaper got it. I know we got a newspaper. It was a couple days late, but I think they published right through it. And of course, the TV stations and the media were still working, and fire and police and hospitals, but nobody was going anywhere. And it was kind of scary. It was fun at first, but we'd already been off school for a week for just snow that year, and then to have this blizzard come in was really exceptional for here.
This is it being exceptional for here. Have we ever seen anything like that? I mean, it wasn't a record snowfall. It wasn't a record anything like that. But
we've had significant snow. I mean, there was snow in December of 2004, and we had like 20 some inches up along Interstate 64, and similar amounts around Evansville and much of the tri-state. So that storm certainly would be in there. And we've had other big snows. We've had windstorms. We've had brutal cold. But to put them all three together, it's only happened a couple times. '78 was one. And we had a near blizzard just a couple years ago here, right after Christmas, where we had the wind and the snow, and technically I think the visibility wasn't, down to whiteout conditions, but it was, they're very rare really for us.
Going back to 1978, obviously there wasn't a lot of, we didn't have the technology we have now, we didn't have the response we had now, we didn't have, there were a lot of things that we just didn't have that we do now. Can you talk about how that impacts a city particularly in the 70s?
Well, in the 70s, the Weather Service, the Weather Bureau at that time, they had, the best equipment of the day, but that's, a shadow of what we have now to work with. Modeling, as we know it today, that helps us predict several, 8 to 10 days out, really was in its early stages and not very reliable. And so in some regards, that storm probably surprised a lot of people. And I'm not certain that there was quite the partnership between the weather community, the Weather Service and the media, and city officials, government, that have to make those decisions on, well, how do we handle an event like this? So, you come to the current era, and, events like this are usually forecast many days ahead. There are conference calls, there's coordination of how we're going to handle this, how we're going to get the snow off the street, and we pre-treat roads. I mean, there are a lot of things we do to kind of mitigate the effect before it actually blows in here. There are very few big surprises in weather anymore. I mean, that is to say, an event that just happens out of the blue, and you're like, well, we didn't see that one coming. There will be small ones, of course, always. I mean, that's the nature of weather. But big events like that, typically, we have several days warning. And, in the 70s, that wasn't top of mind. I mean, people didn't expect to have 3 or 4 days warning on a thing like that. They like it, but they didn't even know it could be possible, so they weren't expecting that.
You mentioned 2004. That's on the list. Let's go ahead and go there, even though I have no idea
Sure.
if it's in order. But the 2004 snowfall, can you talk about, A, just kind of the impact that had, and B, the freakish nature of that storm?
Yeah. The difference between the 78 blizzard and the 2004 storm is we had a lot of information leading up to that said this is going to be a heck of a snow. Models were cranking out 15 inches of snow, which, you look at that, and the thing about model forecasting is, a model can get a hold of a bad piece of information and it can really make it inaccurate. And so you question it, because that's not the norm to have 15 inches of snow. And you're like, well, could this possibly happen? And you're looking at all the probability, and yeah, it could happen. And so, we knew a couple, 3 days out that was going to be an impactful storm, and, would cause some major travel problems. It was right before Christmas there. It was on the 22nd of December, I believe. And, so you had a lot of holiday travelers and just the whole problems that come with a big snowstorm. And then it blew in in the late afternoon and then went all night. And I remember walking outside of the station here, and there was thunder and lightning. Now, anytime you get thunder and lightning and snow together, never good. You're going to get a lot of snow somewhere, and we did. There were spots up along Interstate 64 that had 22 inches of snow on them, and that's a lot to dig out from. There were cars that were trapped up there for overnight, and the National Guard had to come in. But we knew it was probably going to be significant, and everybody was on alert and ready to respond. So in that regard, it's a lot different from, say, a 1978 type storm.
Can you talk about the amount of snow that came in the time period in which it came in?
Yeah, we had 22 inches of snow in about 24 hours. It was like an inch an hour kind of snow, and probably heavier than that when it was really at its peak. I mean, I remember, when there's, like I said, there's thunder, you're having a thunderstorm, but it's snow coming down instead of rain, and it just, it piled up quick.
How did that impact the city, and how did it impact Christmas? I mean, it did thaw fairly quickly, if I remember right. But...
It, of course, it shut everything down for the next day, but most of the response, they were able to get the main arteries and, the streets cleared off in a couple, 3 days. The one problem we had there was it fell on a holiday, so, it looked like at least after, like on Christmas Day, I was trying to leave town to go see my wife's family. And that was the hardest part of the trip, was getting out of town. Once you got to an interstate, you were pretty much good to go. But, big snow like that, it's tough for any city to deal with 22 inches of snow.
2009, staying with the current things, the ice storm. Can you talk about the impact that had, and really just, I guess, describe the event first?
Okay. The ice storm in 2009 was big because it affected so many people and it lasted so long. And we had a huge amount of ice, especially down around Madisonville, western Kentucky, but here in the Evansville area too. You had, some of the thickest ice accumulations we had seen since perhaps the 1920s or teens here in Evansville. And you've got, all your power infrastructure's above ground around here. So power lines came down. You had a lot of people without power for a month at a time. The setup for an ice storm, you had very cold air right on the surface below freezing. And then we had this warm air aloft. But again, it was just like a machine that moisture started coming up and over, and it just coated. And I can remember, again, being here at the station and hearing trees going down, and we were on backup generator for days after that happened. So the setup was, again, it was fairly well forecast. I mean, it wasn't a surprise that we had a catastrophic ice storm. I think the surprise was how long it took to recover after the ice accumulated.
Obviously, this impacted people in Evansville. Talk about what it did to Kentucky.
Well, the thing about the ice storm was it affected just about everybody here in Channel 9's viewing area. I mean, if you just draw a circle around, WNIN, everybody in there had some impact from it. But the key was, if the farther south you went, the worse it was. North of the Ohio River, Evansville, Newburgh, we certainly had damage and power outages and disruptions. But there were places, especially Madisonville and then over toward Paducah, down in the southwestern corner of the Tri-State, and even like Webster County. They had 1.5 inches of ice on their power lines and trees, so everything came down. It literally looked like a tornado had gone through, but, it hadn't. And, I know a couple of people in Madisonville, they were off, they had no electricity for a month. And, that was, once your lights come back on in an ice storm, you're like, oh, okay, well, because it doesn't really, it's not a lasting impact once the ice melts. But yeah, the power outages were just, really unprecedented. I mean, since we've had a power grid in the Tri-State, it has to be one of the few times that you had that many people who were off the grid for that long. I mean, they literally had to rebuild the power grid over portions of western Kentucky because there was nothing left.
There were, a lot of closings and that sort of thing too, kind of shut even Evansville down for a couple of days there. Can you talk a little bit about that? Yeah, I mean,
any winter event that we have will shut a lot of stuff down in Evansville, Henderson, Owensboro. That's just, goes with the territory. A lot of it's precautionary. Schools tend to, and of course they have better information now. They'll go ahead and delay or close early or whatever they need to do to keep students safe, which is all fine. But, there are a lot more people that live here now than there were like in 1937 for the flood and in other events that happened in the past. So anytime we get a few inches of snow on the ground, again, within the WNIN footprint, you're talking about 250,000 people that are impacted in some way or another. And, I think we see a lot more disruption because we're so accustomed to driving everywhere. We're so accustomed to having electricity all the time. So when those things go away, it makes has a big personal impact on the people that we talk to.
Again, I'm going to stay current one more time. 2005, the tornado. That was obviously a major event. A lot of media coverage, a lot of everything. Can you talk about what happened and why it was significant?
The November 6th tornado was unique in that, first of all, it was unexpected. And I've said on this program, most big weather events, there aren't many big surprises in weather. That was one of them for here in the Tri-State. And the reason was, first of all, it happened off season, cool season tornado, November. The weather leading up to it couldn't have been nicer. It was a sunny, pretty day on that Saturday. Saturday night, cold front comes in out of the west, and you have two strong tornadoes that spin up. One that hits, Eastbrook and Newburgh and all that. There was another one that went through, I believe, Webster County to our south, and they were both very strong tornadoes. Of course, the one in Webster County was basically over farmland. I mean, there were a few homes that were damaged or destroyed, but the one that came through Evansville, highly populated and vulnerable population because they're in mobile homes, which are not the strongest structures that you would want to be in a tornado. And it happened at 2 o'clock in the morning. So you had a lot of things that came together to make that especially devastating. People had no way to get the warning. They weren't really thinking that there was going to be a tornado, certainly in November. A lot of people think, well, after June and July, we're done with tornadoes. But the dirty little secret is, or it's not a secret, the truth is that we get tornadoes any day, any month, any year here in the Tri-State. That tornado, I think in a lot of ways, changed people's attitudes about severe weather and their expectation, like for me, for coverage. What do they want? Now, we were on all night covering that tornado, but now when we get severe weather, even if it's not a tornado, just ominous looking skies, people will call the station and want to know why we're not on the air talking about it. Whereas in the past, if you interrupted their program, they would get upset about that, even if it was a tornado warning. So I think it changed a lot of people's perception about the real risk that we face sometimes living here in the Tri-State from tornadoes.
Can you talk about where you were when you heard about that storm? Were you here? Were you working? Did you have some idea it was coming, or was that you got a phone call and had to dash in here?
It happened on a Saturday night. Typically, I don't work on the weekend, and I was talking with our weekend meteorologist at that time. And that's common when we're expecting weather to come in. We talk back and forth and see if we're going to need to stay on late, or two of us work if it's a big event. And it just so happened that, I looked at the weather maps that Saturday. I'd been working out in the yard all day. It was a gorgeous day, and noticed we were under slight risk for severe weather, and saw the cold front and stuff, and talked to the guy and to the weekend meteorologist and said, if anything pops, let me know. Well, then we had a tornado watch later that evening. But it was to our west, and I thought, okay, we've certainly seen a lot of tornado watches where nothing happened, but we're always kind of on guard. We were covered here at the station. And I said, I'll check in at midnight. So I called back at midnight, looked at the computer, and could see a line of thunderstorms to the west. Didn't look like anything. It was just thunderstorms, and we get those. And then they started issuing tornado warnings out to our west, over around between Paducah and Evansville. So I don't know. There was just something that I thought, maybe I should go in. So by the time I was out of bed and, in a suit ready to go to work, they had issued a tornado warning for Posey County, the Weather Service had. So I'm only a few minutes from the station. I got here, and Chad Seawich, our weekend guy, and I at that time, we stayed on the air with it because, Saturday night into Sunday, we just could go wall-to-wall coverage all night. So we're covering the tornado. The winds pick up here at the station. We're seeing, rotation on the radar, but it's not as, again, you see a lot of rotation on radar that doesn't materialize as a tornado. And then we start hearing scanner traffic, in the newsroom that there's some injuries at Ellis Park. There's damage at Ellis Park, and there's possible injuries at Eastbrook. Well, immediately we scrambled. We had a reporter here that night, but we scrambled in other people, and they got out there, and then quickly we learned that, the scope of it. I mean, we didn't really understand the full scope until the sun came up the next morning, and that was the sickliest feeling I've had ever in working here in television, was when the sun finally came up and we saw what happened down there. And you knew there wasn't a chance that you could have awakened all those people in time. That storm was moving at like 70 miles an hour when it came in there. So it was fast moving, very strong, and in the middle of the night.
Jumping over to the next one, the windstorms, 82 June 8th windstorms.
Yeah, the June 8th storm is one of those things for people that live here in Evansville and in Henderson in particular will remember. It was June 8, 1982, and it was a storm that blew in here during the week. I believe it was a Tuesday, if I'm not mistaken. Happened around noon, and it was one of those days where it was just oppressively humid in the morning, and you could just tell something wasn't right. Though it was real still, it just felt odd outside. And by noon, when you look to the west, it was just this greenish black, what we now know is like a shelf cloud or a wall cloud moving in, but it was just as far as you could see on the horizon. And this thing just mowed through town and took down trees everywhere. Garden Park was flattened. WIKY lost their tower, knocked a 500-foot broadcast tower down. And the power was off for many days, if not weeks, in some parts of the area. And it was never a tornado. That's one of the little the myths about that was it was never a tornado. Some people will say, well, I saw a tornado or I saw twisting, but it was just regular old straight line 80-mile-an-hour winds spread over, a 20 or 25 mile wide swath right through some of the most populated areas of the tri-state. So you had major impact from that. And I think it's a kind of a benchmark storm for people who are probably in their 40s and 50s because it was so scary. Here at noon, the street lights came on, it was pitch black out there, and then this thing roared in. And, there were never any confirmed tornadoes with it, but certainly a lot of wind damage. And then the interesting thing about June 8th was you go up to June 8th, 1995, we had another very similar situation. We had a squall line that came in, and again, it mowed down trees, and that happened a little later in the evening. But June 8th is always a day when I see it on the calendar, it's the day that will live in infamy for some of us here in Evansville.
How long did it take to recover from that, and kind of what was the impact that you saw in the city?
I'm sure the recovery from the June 8th storm of 82 was at least, a couple of weeks. I know personally I was supposed to graduate high school on that day, and that we had to postpone it for a couple of days, and our power was off for perhaps 3 or 4 days. But I do know people where their power was off over a week in that storm, and there were trees down over just about every street, so it was a wide-reaching impact.
You talk about the predictable nature of most storms now. Is that something that we could see coming and predict now, or is that the kind of thing that just...
Well, in hindsight, I've thought about that a lot. In looking back at 1982 and all the stuff I've seen here on the radar and in my 25 years of working here, it was a squall line. That's all it was. But it was an intense, bow echo. We would call that, nowadays we would call that a derecho, which is a long-tracked windstorm that basically is it's on a radar. It kind of looks like this, and as the storm goes along, it bows out, and it's right in this bow where you have the strongest winds, and we just happen to be right in the bow. And of course that thing blew through and continued to the east. But I think at that time the radar technology was not what it is today. It was much harder to really see what was happening. Now we can loop the radar, we can look in time, and you can see it evolve. And so, nowadays we would have a much better lead time or warning on a storm like that than we did then.
How long does a storm like that take to blow through town?
Oh, 15, 20 minutes, and it's in and out, yeah.
People talk about the year without summer. What was that?
Yeah. I'm going to have to remember, wasn't there a volcanic eruption?
I think that was what it was.
Yeah. The year without a summer was, a good example of how the global climate can be changed by a catastrophic event. In this case, it was a volcano, and volcanic ash spewed into the atmosphere and, gets into the global pattern, and basically it's like putting a filter between the sun and the earth. So now instead of getting 100% or whatever percent of heat from the sun or infrared radiation, now we're getting maybe 50%. So you had a year there where it just never really got warm, and it's often called the year without a summer. And it was marked by, just days and days of cloudy, overcast skies because you had all this volcanic ash suspended in the atmosphere. And, we've had other events like that in modern times. There was Mount St. Helens in 1980, I believe, and it spread ash that fell out over the tri-state. That was in Washington or in the Northwest, and the ash got into the atmosphere and fell out here. Our skies were brown for a few days, but it wasn't a year, certainly. But it should be a cautionary tale, though. A volcano like that creates that kind of climate change. And, climate change is one of those third rail topics now. It's become politicized, but it's scientifically, it certainly, happens. It has happened for the whole time the Earth has been here. And anytime you put a lot of pollution or stuff between us and the sun, that's going to impact how the two systems interact, your atmosphere here on the Earth and the incoming energy or radiation from the sun.
How did something like that affect the people in the tri-state? Obviously, farming, that sort of thing, all were affected.
I'm sure that, in a year where you don't have warm temperatures and adequate sunshine, I'm sure crops failed, and and they probably thought it was the end of the world because you'd had this huge earthquake just a couple years prior, and now this. So yeah, I would guess that the impact would have been significant. And I think the difference is in those times, nobody was sitting in a weather center, poring over records and looking at stuff. They were trying to survive. I mean, if the corn crop didn't make it, they might not either. And so I don't know that there was as much of a, sort of a worldly view of, cause and effect. I wonder why we're not having this. Well, it might have been a volcano. They didn't know there was a volcano. So, yeah, I mean, the way you would look at impacts in the early 1800s versus today, and our knowledge of them is such, they're light years apart. We talk about snow all the time around here, but rarely do we get that much. And there was one year, though, that stands out among all other in the Tri-State, and that was the winter of 1918. And I still have here in the weather office, I mean, I knew we were going to talk about this, John Payne, who was a longtime weather observer in Evansville. He wasn't around in 1918, but he kept weather records. And in 1918, we had 67.7 inches of snow. That was an all-time record, probably will stand, certainly beyond our lifetimes. There was 28 inches of snow on the ground at any given time during the month of January. That's 28 inches, 2.5 feet of snow on the ground at any one time in January. And the biggest snow that year, let me see here, he wrote that down too. I mean, they just kind of have a 13-inch snow, it just like, well, it snowed again last night. And you think about 1918, you had, downtown you were still using horse and buggies and streetcars and things. Of course, nothing was going. There are pictures from the Evansville newspapers of the snow, just basically cut out like a quarry almost, piled up. Because, I mean, that's a huge amount of snow. That is 4 times what we would typically get. Normally we get about 14, 15 inches of snow. And even these days we're so, weak that we think 14 inches of snow is just horrendous. But that's the normal kind of winter. So, yeah, and there really isn't a way to measure the impact it must have had other than, I can't imagine people even got out, during the first 3 months of 1918.
So 67 inches of snow, again, 28 on the ground
at any given time. Any day, there was at least 28 inches of snow on the ground.
How do you function, especially again in 1918?
Yeah, I have no idea. I mean, you think about 1918, and it's akin a little bit to the 1925 tornado. Communications were not, certainly in 1918, what they are today. I mean, radio was in its infancy. There wasn't really even much commercial broadcasting going on at that point. Certainly not on the level that it is or was even in the 20s or 30s. So you had that against you right away. There wasn't much communication. The newspaper was the mode of communication, but again, the newspaper has to either be purchased, and you have to go out to do that, or delivered, and there probably wasn't a lot of delivery going on, in those days either. And then just basic services. People heated their homes with coal, which had to be delivered by a horse-drawn. I guess the silver lining is you probably didn't have to worry about the Iceman making it because you had plenty of snow around your house. But, and that was coupled with, there was an influenza outbreak that year. So again, really hard, difficult weather conditions there in 1918 and in the early part of the century.
Is there anything else about any of the things we've talked about that you want to say that I haven't thought to ask you?
I think one thing people always joke with me about, they'll say, I'll bet you get tired of hearing about the weather. People always ask me about the weather. And I say, well, no, I look at that as job security. But, it's kind of a truism. Everybody talks about the weather. I mean, everybody does. And, to quote Mark Twain, nobody does anything about it. Of course, we can't. One thing that we do about it now, though, is we discuss it and we have ways to analyze weather and predict it that are much more sophisticated than anything that's existed prior. And I think in many ways, we're better set to handle the extremes in weather that are likely going to come our way. I mean, if you look back in history, history tends to repeat itself. So we'll always, be talking about the weather, but we are doing more about at least forecasting it and preparing for it. And that's what people need to remember, is that they're prepared and they stay informed, a lot of this stuff is not going to be a surprise.